I am Lois Letchford, author of the book Reverse to Memoir, reading the last of our series of The Scientist Who Changed the World. And I really wanted to read about the man, Ignaz Semmelweis, who lived in 1818 to 1865. He was a Hungarian physician whose discovery of the importance of hospital hygiene saved thousands or countless millions of lives. And here's the story. Here's how it goes. In the mid-1840s, a doctor working in one of two maternity wards in the Vienna General Hospital was Ignaz Philipp Semmelweis. He was disturbed that the mortality rate among the mothers was 11%, about 6 times higher than that suffered in another maternity ward. The killer was perpetual fever, often called childbed fever. The really puzzling factor was that the ward where so many mothers were dying of the fever was the posher of the two. This one was where highly trained doctors and surgeons and serious medical research was done. That's where the highest death rate was. In the other ward, the births were handled by mere midwives. In those days, no one understood the fevers. It wouldn't be for decades that they understood that. In Semmelweis's time, the Hippocratic notion of the 4 humours still had important hold on the minds of physicians. So Semmelweis's first breakthrough was the idea that the scientific method could be applied to the problem. He compared the practices in the two wards and put forward several hypotheses as to what might account for the difference in mortality rates. He then tested each in turn by making adjustments to the way his ward was run. None of the adjustments made a difference. One difference was that his own ward was a training establishment. The young doctors worked there performed dissections as part of the training in between tending the mothers. At first, this didn't seem important, but then his friend was accidentally cut while performing an autopsy, and soon afterward died of what looked like, for all the world, like the same fever. Was it possible, Semmelweis thought, there was some kind of cadaveric material that could fatally infect healthy people? Were the trainee doctors unwittingly carrying it from their hands, from the dissecting theatre to the patients? To test his new hypothesis, he insisted that before working with mothers, the medical and nursing staff wash their hands in a solution of hydrochlorinated lime. He insisted this practice in May 1847, and by 1848 the death rate from the fever in his ward had dropped by a factor of 10 to a mere 1.27%. They're still high by modern standards, but it was an incredible achievement. However, the doctors of the Vienna General Hospital were not impressed. They bitterly resented being forced to wash their hands the whole time, both because it was a nuisance and in some cases because they felt the smell of the cadaver on their hands was a mark of distinction. And they refused to believe the new measure had anything to do with the decrease in fatalities. And as a clincher, Semmelweis was Hungarian. He was born in a suburb of Budapest and therefore looked down upon by proud Austrian doctors. Semmelweis's superiors found an excuse to fire him. In the fall of 1860, the mortality rate of the fever in the ward, which Semmelweis's regime had reduced to just over 1%, was at an appalling 35%. In other words, over 1/3 of the mothers who gave birth died soon after. Meanwhile, Semmelweis returned to Budapest and continued to work in obstetrics. Naturally, hygiene was an important part of his regime and was almost alone in the whole of Europe. The hospital saw fewer deaths in any maternity ward. In 1861, Semmelweis gathered the evidence he'd accumulated and wrote a book, The Etymology, Concept and Prophylaxis of Childbed Fever, which he sent to every significant medical society in Europe. In most countries, the medical profession largely ignored him. The exception was the UK, where at least some of the medical establishment had taken notes of a much earlier paper by a US physician, Holmes, The Contagiousy of Puerperal Fever. In 1865, the UK surgeon Joseph Lister, working in the medical school of Glasgow University, made the connection between Semmelweis' research and the importance of hygiene in hospitals. Semmelweis was actually, in the end of his life, confined to a psychiatric ward. It wasn't a happy ending for Semmelweis, perhaps because of the horror of the death toll wreaked by the European medical profession, refused to acknowledge what he'd discovered, or perhaps out of simple frustration. He fell into chronic depression and was committed by his friends to a mental institution, where a few weeks after his committal, he was dead. Very sad story, but it really helps us think about when we don't like the results of something, why? And to look at it again and help us think again. Curiosity helps us think about all sorts of things. And that's what Ignaz Semmelweis did. Read more about him. Check me out, Lois Letchford, on my website, loisletchford.com, and my YouTube channel here. Hit like and hit subscribe. Thank you.